Alrighty, I'm Christine Sills, and this is Casey. We are going to be talking to you about the last bottleneck of continuous delivery and how to get your get out of cab free card. So at some point, you should be able to declare that. At the same time, we are Liatrio. We are members of Liatrio from the consulting and the engineering side. We are a DevOps consulting firm that increases speed and security of your delivery. We work with larger enterprises to help them with their transformations. So, show of hands, how many of you have ever been a member of a CAB or a change advisory board? Awesome, awesome. And how many of you have been a individual that has probably brought a change before CAB in the past? So pretty much everybody's raised their hand on one part of that. I'm surprised to see so many that have been part of a CAB. The good news is you're both going to feel very appreciated and love the fact that you can automate your way out of CAB. So I want to spend the next 15 minutes, so everybody get your magnifying glasses out because you're going to need it. We're going to look at the 60 plus process and procedures that are part of the ITIL service transformation process. Are you ready? I didn't think so either. So instead, I want to really kind of break it down into something a little bit more simple. The Change Advisory Board is really, the advisory is really there on purpose. There is a misnomer in some CABs within the enterprise that they are authorizers or approvers. They are the stop everybody, you can't get there individuals, but really they are really meant to be advisors. And our recommendation is let's put advisor back into their title. Get them back into what it is that they can really truly do for us. So the first thing that the Change Advisory Board deals with is a request. That request is coming from a customer, probably through the business, and for the purpose of delivering something into production. And today, that's being leaned out a lot with project to product. It's being leaned out a lot with agile transformations. So I'm not really going to go into how the request makes it in. But eventually, that request is needed to go into production. We want to implement it so that we can deliver with zero downtime eventually, and at the same time with the highest quality. And giving back to the business because we're delivering what the customer wants. So I'm really going to touch on what happens from a certified perspective, which is really what the advisory board is trying to do. They want to certify that what you're delivering is not going to introduce risk. It's not going to create havoc when it goes into production, and it's meeting the quality that the customers are expecting. The Change Advisory Board, I want to really focus on evaluation of change planning, and change review reporting, because I believe a lot of that can be automated. Given the state of where we're at with technical delivery and the automation that's built into being able to spin up environments, build and deploy applications, I think we can actually automate a lot of those. The Change Advisory Board is looking to assess risk, determine if the resources are aligned. That could be funding resources, software, tools, implementation. They're doing release deconfliction. They're doing documentation and continuous improvement, and they communicate change. What's a common thread that you think is running through all of this? It's very manual. A lot of the time, each of these things that they're doing is very manual. Someone's having to submit a request. They're looking at it to see if it's going to fit the right timeline. They say, I want to go in the third weekend of February, and they're looking for deconflictions to see what's happening around that time. Is that the right time to be deploying? They're making sure that you filled out all your documentation. Did you get your test strategy written up? Do you have your test plan out there? Do you have your release documentation ready? And then they're doing a lot of the communication for you. So where could you go if you really want to automate it? Really start asking questions. What is it that they're really looking for? There's 60 processes within this that ITIL has recommended that they look for around test plans, test strategy, coverage. They're looking for release readiness. They're looking at problem and incident management, what has happened in the past. Really dig in for your organization and determine what is it that they're really looking for. Different organizations may be looking for different things, but ask the questions. Dig a little bit deeper. One of the things that I'm going to touch on in just a minute, we started finding at an organization that I worked for, we started finding that what they were discovering was a lot of our testing was manual. Unit testing was being augmented by integration testing. Production releases were manual. But why was that happening? Because there was a missing in trust. We didn't have the automated features in place. At that time, we came up with quality gates. So as you organize and ask those questions, what is it that they're really looking for? Put them into themes. The themes that we came up with were quality gates that could be opened or closed as to whether you were mitigating the risk, you were doing what you were supposed to do. Source control. This organization had source control that was in folders, source control that was in Subversion, source control that was in Git. It was in all different kinds of places. And so this organization identified exactly the expected of source control, that it needed to be version controlled, it needed to be a source of truth. Everything could be source control, code as well as test. This 80% code coverage, getting back to unit testing, trying to shift unit testing to the left. At the change review, they were looking at test automation, not unit test. And what was happening was we had probably 10 to 20% unit test coverage, and we needed to get that increased to an 80% unit test coverage. Automated rollback. Implementations into production were causing severe incidents. We were having high severity 1, 2, and 3 incidents. And so there was the missing automated rollback was missing, as well as automation of change orders. The fact that you had to manually go into ServiceNow or you had to manually go into the service system in order to get those change orders in. What we did was we went across the organization and started to assess where they were at and made a recommendation. We called them gates, quality gates, and we made a recommendation that if you could build into your build and package pipeline each of the gates, and you could show that you were mitigating that in an automated way, the gates could be opened or closed. If the gate was open, you could move to the next phase, and eventually, if you could secure the majority of the gates that made sense for your application, the gates would be open for a single path to production. So everybody wants a get out of CAD free card. So the assessments, when we went in and we started doing assessments within the organization, we took applications exactly where they were at and determined what they could or couldn't do. And as they could get a check mark for source code, optimum branching strategies, static analysis, greater than 80% code coverage, vulnerability scans, we started where they were at and then monitored them to see could they implement everything. Once all of the check marks and all of the gates had been opened and the artifacts were being stored for ease of retrieving, they had a single path to production and could actually get out of CAB free. It's not an overnight thing. So like I said, assess where you're at, understand what the CAB is looking for, look for ways to automate them, and then start to check off them and get those artifacts stored so that you can have a single path to production. I'm talking about the manual things that you can do, but I want Casey to kind of talk to a couple of the automations that you can do within this space.
Cool. Thanks, Christine. So I really appreciate the perspective that Christine brings to the role that the cab plays in the software delivery process and the effort to increase safety, which is the role the cab's playing there. But what I really liked about what Christine was talking about there was the way in which the cab offers a faster path to production, where you're able to identify those very specific things that are, if an application can accomplish those, can get to production faster. And but what I think is interesting about it is that's not just increasing speed, that's also increasing safety. Because what you're doing is you're instead of having the cab be very subjective and using subjective measures to determine application readiness, now they're using objective things to measure, yes, this application is ready to proceed. But the challenge here is the cab is still doing that certification process. They're still having to look at the change and say, did all of these things get done? These might be individually automated, but the cab is still responsible for certifying that all these things happened. And so what I'd like to use the rest of the time we have today is to discuss an approach in which the policy that the cab is writing can actually be automated. And so we're going to dig deep into this approach that I'm going to share here in a minute. But let me say it this way. We want to get the cab out of the business of meetings and writing documents and get them writing code. We think that the cab should be creating policy that can actually be executed as a part of your software delivery process. So in this picture, there's a few things that we're going to cover. On the left, you've got all these systems that are already likely in your organization. Probably not all of these, but this is just an example of the types of systems you'd see. These systems are generating events. For example, you've got SonarQube doing static analysis of your source code, generating events about code coverage and code quality. You've got tools like Bitbucket or GitHub certifying that commit ID was in fact in a trusted repo, and that there was a pull request, and the pull request was reviewed and approved by the appropriate people. These are all events that you're able to start to collect. You've got information from tools like Harbor or ECR, Amazon's ECR service, or Artifactory or Twistlock about static analysis that's being performed against your images before you deploy them. So the goal here is, first of all, we're going to talk about collectors. Collectors are things that collect all these events from all these disparate systems in your environment and then converts them into a standard language. In this case, Grafeas, which is an open source project from Google. And so we'll talk about what that looks like in just a minute. But the collectors are taking all these events in all these different formats, turning them into occurrences in Grafeas. The second thing we're going to talk about here today are attesters. Attesters are ways of taking the policy that's defined as code from the cab and then running them through a tool called OPA, Open Policy Agent. And then if all of the policy that the cab defined meets the criteria, then the attesters will create an attestation in Grafeas. And then finally, you've got enforcers that are ensuring that the attestations were created for the software before it's deployed. Those enforcers are making sure that, in this case, we're going to talk about a Kubernetes example, pods are not able to run in your cluster unless the images in the pod had properly been attested to. So first, let's dig into the collectors. In this example, we're going to talk about a collector that's collecting events from Amazon ECR. For those that aren't familiar, Amazon ECR is a managed Docker registry that Amazon offers. One of the nice things that ECR has, in addition to storing your Docker images, is it can also perform static analysis security scans for CVEs of your images. ECR generates events into CloudWatch events anytime a scan occurs. What we've done is we capture those events from CloudWatch events, and we deliver them to an Amazon SQS queue. The collector is then pulling the queue and converting those messages that it receives from ECR into something called an occurrence. We'll talk about what that is in a minute, but the occurrence is the language that Grafeas speaks, and so we're able to take that event and store it in a common format. The collector is configured through Kubernetes custom resources that are defined in your cluster, so we can configure what types of systems are in your environment and then collect that into Grafeas occurrences. Thanks. So Grafeas, what is that? It is I refer to it as an open source project that Google released. Think about it as an API with a database, and it collects metadata about artifacts that you want to run in your system. So Grafeas stores various kinds of information, which are the different rows that you see there. And for each kind of information that it'll store, there's this concept of a note and of an occurrence. And for those that have done object-oriented programming, think about a note kind of like a class, and occurrence is an instance of that class, is the best analogy I've got. So like if we were to look at an example, an attestation. An attestation note would represent an attestation authority, or getting real specific, a PGP key, the ability to sign something on behalf of the system. Whereas an attestation occurrence is an actual signature of an artifact that we'd like to deploy. If you look at a build kind, let's keep going down the list. We're not going to go through all these, but just want to make sure it sinks in. So a build note would be like a Jenkins server. You've got this one Jenkins server running. It's running a specific version of Jenkins. That is a note in Grafeas of kind build. Every time a build run executes on that Jenkins server, a new occurrence would be created that refers back to that note. Cool. So Grafeas is this metadata API server where you can collect all this information about everything happening in your software supply chain and presenting it in a standard API. So if we look at an example of this, here's our Amazon ECR console. So we ran a scan on an image. The scan found 9 findings that are of high severity and 4 medium severity findings. And we've got this one finding in particular that I'm going to then cross-reference with the JSON that gets created for Grafeas. So on the right here, this is a JSON representation of the occurrence that gets stored in Grafeas for that finding, RHSA 2019-1492, whatever. It's a finding about bind DNS. Everything goes back to DNS. So this is a vulnerability in DNS that was found in the image that was created. So what happens is the collector takes the event that comes out of ECR and turns it into that Grafeas occurrence. Okay, so next we got to talk about attesters. Attesters are things that are monitoring the activity in Grafeas. As we're creating these occurrences, Grafeas is saying, oh, okay, I see a new occurrence for this resource, this Docker image. I'm going to load all the other occurrences for that image, and then I'm going to feed them all into OPA. OPA has policies that are defined by the CAB that define what are the criteria by which we will attest to or approve this image to move on. Did all of those things get checked in all the different systems? If so, the attester then creates an attestation, a signature, a digital signature for the image that we're trying to run. The configuration for the attester also comes from etcd. There's a custom resource for defining your attester. And then the PGP key is stored as a Kubernetes secret in this example for configuring the attester for doing this digital signature. So here's an example of a policy that the CAB would define for OPA, for attesting to the images that are going to be run in the environment. OPA uses a language called Rego, which if you're familiar with Prolog, you'll be right at home. If not, then you might want to buckle up. So this first example here, so what you have here is a bunch of violation rules. Each of these rules is checking for truth statements, and if everything is true in the block, then we've identified a violation. So if we look at this first violation here, there's a couple things we're checking for. First, we're looking for, are there any occurrences where the analysis status is not equal to finished success? So we look at all the occurrences for an image. Are there any that are like finished failure or aborted or error? Anything other than success, boom, that counts as a violation. But likewise, we've got another rule that says, hey, let's just check, maybe there's no analysis yet. Maybe we haven't even run a scan, in which case the count of analysis is set to 0. So that's a separate rule, but also looking at, in this case, image scans from ECR. And then the next block of rules, we're looking for not just did the scan run, but let's check the severity counts. So we've got rules that say you can't have anything more than 0 critical severity, pretty good rule. And then there's another rule that's looking for high vulnerabilities, and it's allowing up to 10 vulnerabilities before this rule will fail. So what this is showing, again, this is allowing the CAB to write policy in an executable form that then can be run as all of the events are occurring inside your system. All right, the last thing we're going to cover are enforcers. So an enforcer it's implemented as a Kubernetes validating and mission webhook. So as the control plane for the cluster is having pods created, those are getting called into the enforcer. The enforcer is looking at all of the images that are defined in the containers for the pod. And if any of those images do not have attestations created for them and that are defined in Grafeas, then the pod will not be allowed to run inside the cluster. So not only are you automating the attestation, you're also now automating the enforcement of those policies at the front door of the cluster. So this is an example of a JSON payload that the Kubernetes control plane will provide to the webhook. We see that amongst other things in this payload at the bottom there's an image there. That's just an image URL for our image that's defined inside Amazon ECR. And so on the next, what we then see is this is the occurrence inside Grafeas. That image ID correlates, so that image in the validating emission webhook is also referred to by an occurrence. The occurrence has a PGP signature on it, so we know that this image, in fact, met all the requirements for the policy that we wrote. So let's do a demo. Let's run this. So in this demo, what I want to do is I'm going to run a Kubernetes deployment for an Nginx image inside our cluster, but I haven't run the scan yet. So if everything's right, the enforcer should block the image from running. Then we'll jump over to the Amazon console, do the scan, and then the Kubernetes server should reconcile that and continue to run the pod. Eventually, it'll succeed. So we do a kubectl run on the Nginx pod. We're then able to see if we do a get on deployment, that the deployment is created, but that there is no active pods running. If I do a describe on the replica set to figure out why the pods aren't running, I can see an error at the bottom here that says unable to find an attestation for default attester. So we ran the deployment created a replica set, the replica set tried to create a pod, the pod was blocked from admission into our cluster because, well, there's no attestation for it yet. So the enforcer did its job, and if we were to take a look at Grafeas, we could curl the Grafeas endpoint for that image ID, and we see that, yes, in fact, we get no occurrences back for that image. No attestations have been created, no scans have been performed. Of course, this image can't run in our cluster. So if we jump over the AWS console, we can now initiate a scan for our image. This scan jumps to in progress and then will quickly complete. It's a relatively small image. At that point, our scan has been performed. Behind the scenes, that scan pushes events to CloudWatch events. Those events end up in AWS SQSQ, which then get collected and converted into Grafeas occurrences. If we look at Grafeas now, if we curl that Grafeas endpoint again, now instead of getting no results, we'll see that there's an attestation, and we see that the discovery was completed and shows finished successfully. So now we've got two different occurrences in Grafeas. We have the one for the original scan event, and then we have this other occurrence that we're looking at here, which contains the PGP signature from the attester that, hey, everything's good with this policy, this image is ready to run. So if I jump back into the Kubernetes cluster and describe the replica set again, I see that I've got a pod created, and if we get pods, we see that sure enough, we now have Nginx running in our cluster. Nginx was created because everything's good, our policy's been enforced in the environment. So we just walked through an approach by which you can take all these events going on in your system, all the events that the cab has defined as should be done in order to get a fast path to production. And then we've come up with an approach by which we can collect those events into Grafeas occurrences. We can take the policy out of documents and put it in an executable format that OPA can then run. And then we've come up with an approach by which we can enforce that those attestations were actually occurring and stop the execution of any applications in our trusted environments unless all of the policies met the requirements. And so we're pretty excited about this, but I've got one other thing I wanted to share, and that is we've decided that we want to engage the community on this idea. So I'm actually announcing that we're open sourcing this effort today, so would love to get some feedback from the community on this. Everything in the Kubernetes ecosystem is nautical, so we had to come up with a nautical term. So we named it RODE, R-O-D-E. RODE is the chain that connects an anchor to the boat, so figured software supply chain, it works. So two asks for the community. One is would love people to follow this. It's still under development. There's a lot of work being done, especially on the collector side. So would appreciate some stars and follows and some feedback on the work that we're doing here. But the other ask is we'd love some contribution. So if people are interested in this space, if you want to contribute either with comments like this is a horrible idea, that'd be great, or opening issues, of course we'd love code too. Yeah, would love to continue the conversation. We have a booth out here today as well in the hallway, so you can find us there if you want to talk more about the effort. But that's it for today. We'll turn it back over to moderator and love to have feedback on this.
Okay, thank you. So would like to come forward and discuss and talk about some challenges that you're seeing in this area. So we'll start off with you, Matthew.
So there was an interesting comment that was made about transitioning cabs to code. But if you have legacy operations teams that own the cab process that don't get code, don't understand code, don't want to understand code, how can they possibly start down the steps in this path?
Did you want to? No, go. Thank you, Matt. You stole my thunder, so thank you for doing that. Thank you, first of all, for the talk. Very invigorating. Thank you for donating to open source. Grafeas is good. I want to look at that. Docker Notary is something similar that I've looked at in the same space, or something I have more familiarity with doing the OWASP checks and part of my DevOps pipeline. All of that is fun stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But with respect, you did not answer the question that how does it come together? This is all after we have all had the kumbaya anyways. The cabs I'm familiar with have an aversion to code. And until you overcome that, all of that is yet more code that the developers wrote, and therefore, by definition, not to be trusted. So that question remains unanswered.
I guess what I was wondering if there was some sort of perverse incentive here that y'all were going down, in a good way, to basically, okay, legacy world, on-premise world that can't do cloud native, therefore can't take advantage of this tooling, they just suffer, they never get their features, and they get starved out. And if you're cloud native, then you get all the checkboxes and you go, is that the kind of incentive that y'all are trying to drive here?
Let me try to. Oh, sorry, here. I would say it wasn't an intentional trying to kind of force them to a more modern cloud native approach. Rather, that's a model that our customers are adopting and that we have a lot of skill in and expertise in. So that was why we chose that framework for developing the solution. But yeah, it wasn't intended to be a kind of wean people off.
And the example was around moving from on-prem into the cloud and automating it as you go. So it could be new as cloud native or migration. And so as you're building that out, if you can automate those checkpoints and build it into, it can definitely help from that cab perspective. And I echo what you're saying about cab and the fact that that's now more code. So one thing that I've seen great success is in running like small training scenarios in which you can get a small group of people, run a lab around how to use that software, break it down so that asking all of the questions, what is it that you're really trying to do, break it down and help them move from point A to point B.
One other suggestion I would have is if there was an aversion to code and a lack of trust with code from the cab, would be to run them in parallel. So bring the attestation to the cab. So rather than the cab starting with, okay, tell me about your change, tell me what you did, the entry point to the cab could be, here's a piece of software, and here's all the automation that's already been run, and according to our automation, we would approve this thing. And that would be an opportunity to develop trust that, hey, this thing is actually finding software that we're confident with, and it's catching things that we would have caught or maybe not have caught as well. So there's an opportunity to run that manual process in parallel while building confidence.
Thank you for that. Actually, some people did raise their hands when you asked which people have been in cabs. I actually would like if I may put them on the spot, to hear from them. If you saw this as part of the approval, where it says this has passed the attestations, check mark, gone through the DevOps pipeline, would you curtail your cab meeting from an hour to 10 minutes, saying it's all good, go to prod?
Is there somebody who's been part of a cab who would step forward? I'll come back to you. Yeah, come on. Someone new in the conversation. Thank you. I'll hold.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. We don't have a cab as such because we're not an enterprise. We're a startup. I'm on the infrastructure team at Texio. We don't necessarily like ping you like, hey, you can't do this, but we do have things that check every single server. And when we go and we're like, hey, there's like, you have an open database. We turned it off because it's in staging and you don't need it yet, right? Basically, all of those instances are something that we would like to automate. Yeah. Like, we're the infrastructure team, so we code anyway, right? So we might be a better audience for this than like a conventional cab, because like we don't want to look at people's pull requests all the time, right? We want it to be in CI.
Cool. Thank you. Come back to you.
Yeah, I would also approve it too. But I guess one of the good things about cabs and having in a startup environment, sometimes just getting people to talk to each other for 10 or 15 minutes when they won't, and then it leads to chaos in production, is a good thing, and a cab can be a structure there. But I guess it's how do you find this path back to this enterprise that is living in ServiceNow and it's not going to change for decades? You know, how do you bridge the gap and get, you know, because I mean, some sort of ServiceNow integration for this tool, and then what's the real source of truth? Is, you know, Augeus, whatever it was. Augeus is a different tool. Is that the source of truth, or is ServiceNow still your CMDB that's used? So lots of interesting.
Well, let's move on to successes in this area. So, who has had success with changing kind of the viewpoint of cab to more of an automated, more of an accept code kind of environment? So, come on up. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually, I'm at Columbia Sportswear. We just implemented last week some automation for that. We're still not far enough as we would like, but we've at least automated creation of change requests, automatically closing, automatically checking if you have standard change requests in right now. That's just a step, you know, just our first step, and we've been working very, very close with the change review board, seeing what they want to see, seeing what they need, and then our next step is also to work. We're dark launching it, and so everybody can kind of get used to that. They all are going to be acting as like standard changes, so they're all going to keep being able to be approved. And then once our brand new system is ready and ready to go, then we're going to start having the real process. But we wanted to get the developers to get used to it, and our change review board to also get used to it as well. And we've been working really closely with them.
Can I ask you an amplifying question? You mentioned run them in parallel. Is that what you're doing? Are you running, is this dark mode running in parallel?
Yeah. So the automation is just in the dev world right now. That way, again, they can get used to it, get the functionality going, and then they can ask questions and we can make changes, and it won't be very impactful at the moment.
Okay, great. Anybody else have a success story here from? Oh, come on, great.
Yeah,
I gotta hold it.
My bad.
Believe me, I'm not that picky about the microphone, but they tell me, hold it.
So I have a couple of interesting stories. I currently work for a very large organization with very old school cab thinking. One of the things that we have the capability of, we have what's called a standard change. And so basically a development group can go through the process of getting a standard change created in ServiceNow, which we do live in, unfortunately. That does allow things like updates and, you know, build pipelines to trigger automatically without having to go for a manual cab board. As long as you're going against that change that's already been agreed upon, that happens. So we've actually built APIs around that so that all of our pipelines can do all the boring old school stuff they need to do without bugging anybody. In a previous life, though, one of the things we did when we first kind of came up against ITIL and DevOps and how they were like counter to each other, we actually got our change board to approve the pipeline. So if our pipeline is approved, which generally it's in code anyway somewhere, there's a GitHub repo behind it. If the cab likes your pipeline and they like the controls and gates you've put in it, if they approve your pipeline, they have no reason reason to argue every time your pipeline runs. It's like, okay, your pipeline worked yesterday. It's still the same pipeline, so we're happy with that. Just keep doing it, because you're never going to get to that, one deploy every 5 minutes thing without that kind of worldview. So that was some of the successes we've had. We still fight the good fight with change boards every day, but that's.
So if I can ask, you said deployments every 5 minutes. How your standard pipeline? How often can that run in good times?
I think that's more to do with our developer teams and how efficient they've made their build process. I have some teams it takes hours to run their pipeline, especially if they're doing like dynamic code analysis and stuff like that. We're trying to get to the point where that doesn't need to happen for every minor. Oh, I fixed a comment in your code somewhere. Oh, well, that's a 2-day process just to trigger that off again. Some of our more mature pipelines, they can definitely run multiple times a day. We're a big legacy org. A lot of our ops people are still legacy thinking. That's not something we see across the board, but we do have the capability to do it. I mean, I've got pipelines that are running, a couple times an hour for some of our teams, which in my org is very exciting.
Okay, great. Come on.
So I know my comments could have been interpreted as rather acerbic, so I want to spread some love to cabs who are as progressive as apparently yours. So great for doing that. Actually, two kinds of cabs that I've found very what I would say amenable to working with are number one in heavily regulated industries, pharma or fintech, to where I've worked most, pharma mostly, is where I love the human touch. Is they say, look, if this change, I know it went to your pipeline, if this doesn't work, people could literally die. And I know Jez and Dave talked about it in the morning. So I love the moment of pause in that 1 hour meeting where I can sit down and say, yes, it's my pipeline, I trust it implicitly, but how much? I mean, the impact is really life-threatening. So that's one kind of cab conversation is good. Secondarily, and this might come across as a counterpoint to what you said, is I love cabs who say, if you have a one-line change and it takes 2 hours, you're not getting a pass, go fix your pipeline. So nobody gets it. So cabs who put their foot down there and say, we approve the pipeline, but hey, engineers, you designed the pipeline. If it's 2 hours long and your change took 2 minutes to do, you fix the problem. Don't expect me to say bypass a manual test or functional test or whatever the slow part of the pipeline is. We're not doing that. I love those two cab conversations, but I've had the ones where just they can't go beyond the fact you're just showing me a code demo. I don't know. Now I gotta think up. You gotta explain all of that to me again, and I'll think about if I approve it or not.
Yeah, just to follow up on this, I think losing that human element of. And also there's this danger of so much automation, so much abstraction, you lose visibility, you don't even know how the systems work before, and it's a balance.
So what do you want to see in 2 to 5 years? What do you want your cab to look like? Do you want it to look like an OPA rule set? Or do you still want the human speed involved? So what do you want to see from your cab? Okay, great.
So I almost want the cab to not exist, only as an outlier, right? I want my engineers, my developers, my ops folks all to work together as a team, as well as quality, and automate as much as possible. If we're all aligned on that, right, changes, that acceptable change, that bar goes up, right? And then suddenly so many more changes become far more accessible to everyone in the organization, and anyone can pull the lever. And the cab is really just for major sort of one-off changes. Obviously, the panacea would be none at all. All changes are automatically checked. And I think that's the gold ring we all strive for, and we shouldn't stop trying to reach that. But we also can have a tendency to lean on a cab as a safety net, right? On both sides of that coin, right? On one side of the coin, the business can say, you didn't follow the process, you didn't have a rollback plan that was adequate, you didn't have a plan C and D. In the engineering side, we can easily say, well, you made me jump through all these hoops, I spent so much time writing up this documentation, I didn't have enough time to write the actual code. And then it becomes a blame game, and that's just a spiral, right?
So I'd like to say you threw a phrase out there, anybody can pull the lever. And I think what you meant to say is anybody can feel like they can stop the deployment because they see a quality gate. And I think that's one of the things when I talk to a lot of my customers about lean software, and I go and talk about lean manufacturing and how in a lean manufacturing plant, anybody on the production line from start to finish can stop that production line completely if they see a quality problem. And I think that is one of the key things I would like to see coming out, is where everybody feels it's their responsibility to stop a bad release from going forward, from the developer to, and not having to rely on a CAB board, not having the opportunity to say, it's somebody else's problem. It is my problem. That's what I want to see, is my developers get much more involved in everything about this product. Quality, security is my problem. Anyone else? Then I'm going to tie it together with one last thing. So Dave Farley talked about DevOps, and the biggest impediment to continuous delivery has a lot to do with the way the executives view the way that you're using automation. And they don't see a lot of this automation as critical to the product you're developing. And I would tie this back to what I want to see in 2 to 5 years is my executives understand why I'm using OPA and not like a change board that they remember from their ITIL days 10 years ago. So that's where we like to go. Great. So thank you very much. The box lunches should be out today. Appreciate you coming.